slama dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj zemljoradnih ljudi i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada. Mir tvojim lađama na pučini i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem dika. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem dika.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. You join us for the Hangover special. And no, I don't mean the movie by Todd Phillips. It is the Hangover from the night before, which was the most repulsive spectacle of deception that we've had in this country since the last one. By that I mean, of course, we have the fallout from a general election which nobody won, but certainly somebody lost. And that somebody, of course, was the Conservative and Unionist Party under the ill-fated reign of Rishi Sunak. And he has promptly resigned the party leadership and will presumably be retreating to a place he feels much more comfortable, which is probably the United States and Silicon Valley. He will not be hanging around. He will hang around just long enough to make sure that somebody else is put in his place, and then he'll be off. He won't hang around as an MP. He'll be gone very soon afterwards. Maybe his colleagues will prevail upon him to stay on long enough that Reform don't win his seat, but who knows? So he's on the road quite soon. Sir Keir Starmer, always important to give a man a title that he's earned, is the Prime Minister now, but that does not, of course, tell us the full story. So let's start looking at that story, and we are going to start looking at it with the assistance of the Financial Times website. If you will bear with me for just a moment, I will share that with you. So you should be able to see there the readout of the results as shown to us on the Financial Times site. So you can see here, Labour, large party, 411 seats. Conservatives, 121. There are only 2 seats left to declare, by the way. Liberal Democrats, 71. SNP, that's the Scottish Nationalists, and I'll be coming to them in just a moment because that's a rather entertaining story, are on 9. Sinn Féin, the former Irish National Liberation Party, now pro-NATO and pro-EU, on 7. The reason why there's the dash next to the name is because they don't take their seats in the British Parliament, still to this day. DUP, that's Ian Paisley's old party, lost 3 seats. Reform, that's Nigel Farage's gang, got 4. Greens got 4, worse luck. Plaid Cymru got 4. SDLP, that's the you always used to be described as the moderate nationalist party in the occupied 6 counties of Ireland. 2. Alliance 1, that's a sort of liberal party in the occupied 6 counties of Ireland. The Ulster Unionist Party, which used to be the dominant reactionary party in the occupied 6 counties, got destroyed by the DUP a few years ago, but they've made something of a comeback. Now, other are on 8, and that other includes several independents who we will come to in just a moment. So what we can see here is, what if you just looked at this side of the chart and ignored everything else, you would think that Labour was an incredibly popular party. But of course, this is not necessarily true. And what we can tell from looking at the vote share is that they have benefited not from an enormous surge in their own popularity, but from the total collapse of the Conservative Party. So we can see here, total votes of the Labour Party, 9,686,773. Conservative Party, 6,814,469. That's just about double what the Liberals got. However, there are some rather unusual quirks to the British electoral system, which viewers overseas might not be familiar with. Let's go down here to Reform. So you notice this. Liberal Democrats got 71 seats based on 3,499,933 votes. Reform got 4 seats based on 4,091,549 votes. Now, why the disparity, you may ask, if you're not familiar with the first past the post electoral system. It's because Reform came second in an awful lot of seats, came third in an awful lot of seats, and picked up consequently a gigantic amount of votes, which, because they came second or third behind Labour and Conservative, or Liberal sometimes, didn't go anywhere. See, there's no proportionality in our electoral system. So you can get 4 million votes and only get 4 MPs. Now that's actually slightly less votes, if I'm remembering this correctly, than UKIP, which is Farage's predecessor party, got in 2015. In 2015 elections, UKIP got 4.5 million votes and didn't get a single MP. Now they get 4,091,000 votes and got 4. So what it does show us, though, and if you look at the percentage points, it's there, 14.3. They were polling Reform on like 20, 21, 22%, which shows that Reform's figures were overstated. Basically, what Reform have got is largely, though there will be some variations here, it's that UKIP vote from 2015 that has gone to Farage. And were it not for Farage's intervention and a hell of a lot of media coverage and advertising, they wouldn't have got this. They wouldn't have got this result at all. We will come back to Reform in a moment. Greens did much better, but again, that's no reason to celebrate. The Greens, if you're not familiar with them, if you think about the German Greens, Annalena, 360 degrees Baerbock, Robert Habeck, people like that, well, ours are no better. They're into all the same shite, pro-EU, pro-NATO, and pro a whole bunch of other things which don't bear mentioning. Actually, no, I will mention them, and I will mention them in the context of the SNP later on. The Greens are a deeply shady, deeply corrosive organisation. They are as much of a fake alternative on the left as Reform are on the right. So that's the picture. That's the quirks of the electoral system. You can get 4 million votes and only get 4 seats. You can get 3 million votes and get 71. Because what the reason why the Liberals pick up so many is because they held their core votes that they got at the last election. So they only got 12.2% of the vote. But their vote increased slightly but didn't go down. What happens is because they were in second place in an awful lot of constituencies, particularly in the English southwest, you end up benefiting from the total collapse of the Conservative vote, which is just what's happened. So let's get then to Sir Keir Starmer, our beloved new Prime Minister, an inspiring man in so many respects. I'm delighted to take over. It's such a marvellous day. I've got to meet King Charles. We were both friends of Jimmy Savile, do you know? So let's talk about Keir Starmer. Let's talk about what kind of majority that they actually have. So I'm just going to stop sharing that for now. So let us go then to some more statistics, because I know you, dear viewers, will love these. So Keir Starmer wins the election and gets a 80-plus majority with a vote that is, in total, 9,686,329. Okay, final figures aren't quite decided yet, but it's going to be around about the 9.5 million mark, right? Now, Labour under Jeremy Corbyn, about whom you've heard me say many accurate things, and I discussed on last night's broadcast my opinions on what would have become of his government, and those opinions, of course, have not changed in 24 hours. I merely make this point to demonstrate a point about, a broader point about the construction of narratives. So Labour in 2019, where the Labour Party lost a ton of seats and it was declared a disaster, the worst Labour result since 1933, 1931. Catastrophe. He's the new, Philip Snowden or something. He's the new Michael Foot was the common reference point there. But let's take a look at this. Labour vote in 2019 was 10,269,051. So you get that. That's around about 600,000 more votes in 2019 than they got now. And so what you see is that as the BBC's own psephologist, electoral analyst, John Curtis, I think he's from the University of Strathclyde, said on their broadcast, the Labour vote in England barely went forward at all. The Labour vote in Wales went down because Labour's actually been in power in Wales. They run the regional government there. And so, again, they have a record there already, which doesn't make them particularly popular. So their vote in England and Wales barely goes forward. In Wales, it goes down. In Scotland, Labour gains quite a bit from the collapse of the Scottish National Party, about whom more later. But overall, lower vote for Keir Starmer than Corbyn got in 2019. Let's go to 2017, an election I campaigned in for the Labour Party, much to my deep regret now. 2017, Labour won 12,877,918 votes. So that's, again, that is over 3 million more votes in 2017 than they got now. Tories won considerably more votes then as well. Because what happened then was Labour actually got more people to the polls. I mean, speaking from direct experience, you did in the latter part of that campaign in 2017, in some areas we were campaigning in Bolton and Bury, two places in Greater Manchester, if you're not familiar with what I'm referring to. And we did start to see some more working class people turning out, so committing to voting Labour for all their very, very bad experiences with the Labour Council and previous Labour MPs. So you got people motivated to go to the polls then, because again, Corbyn seemed different. And for all my my accurate diagnoses of the man and his politics, I will say that even in 2019, he was still generating enthusiasm. Like, I was in a pub car park in a country town in 2019, and Corbyn showed up there and attracted like a vast crowd, like middle of a weekday. Like, no, I mean, the only political leader who could probably do that now would be maybe Farage. None of the rest of them could. So there was a genuine level of popularity there. And again, it's because he seems to be offering something different, a way out of the impasse. And we'll come back again. We're going to come back to that one in a moment. But let's go back further. So 12 million votes there was the high point of the Labour vote since 1997, where they got 13,518,167. So Keir Starmer gets this massive majority on a lower vote than the Corbyn-led party got in its two elections, and on a lower vote by quite some distance than the great Blair landslide in 1997, which I'm old enough to remember. And I remember that back then, as I've said before, people bought into Blair's rather non-specific idea of change and modernisation. Yeah, he was very careful not to fully explain what that was, but people bought into it, and there was much more of a positive feeling of change in the country back then. There is none of that today, and none of that. But we go back even further. Go back to 1992. Arch loser Neil Kinnock. How many votes did he get? 11,557,062 in the 1992 general election. And he lost that one to John Major. So Keir Starmer is getting in on lower votes than previous Labour Party leaders have got when they lost elections. So let's just register that. This is not a case of them going forward. Like, they got ahead in Scotland because the SNP, Scottish National Party, deservedly collapsed. And they got ahead in England because, again, the Conservative Party deservedly collapsed. So we will now move on to look at some of the more localized results. So I'm going to go and just look up some of these results so I can show you constituency by constituency in order that you can gain a more thorough understanding of the electoral picture here. So just having a look here. So I'm going to show you something interesting now. I'm going to show you the results in Keir Starmer's constituency. Now, Keir Starmer is, of course, as I said, Sir Keir, is the new Prime Minister. And you would expect the new Prime Minister coming in with a massive majority, that he's going to be coming in with a huge vote in his own constituency. Wrong. Look at this. This is Holborn and St Pancras, which, if you're not from perfidious Albion, you may be thinking is a place in a J.R.R. Tolkien novel, but it is a real place. Trust me, I've been there. This is Starmer's seat. Now look at this. He actually loses 17.4% of the vote he had last time. he gets 18,884. Coming in second is Andrew Feinstein. Now, Feinstein gets 7,312 plus 18.9%. That's, of course, Feinstein didn't stand last time. So, Feinstein is, of course, a former MP in South Africa who is now living over here and chose to challenge Starmer specifically on Starmer's support for the genocide in Gaza. And of course, Starmer wins, but you would think that a popular leader of a party that is sweeping all before it, which is what a lot of the narratives out there in the bourgeois press are trying to convince you of. You'd think if Starmer was in the position of Blair in 1997, which is a comparison they are trying desperately to make, if they thought longer and harder about that, these people putting these things together, they would probably not make that comparison. But again, more on that later. But it's not the case. If you look at Blair when he won in 97, like massive boost to his own majority in his old seat up in the northeast of England. So Starmer holds on, but again, loses a significant chunk of his votes to an independent challenger who'd never stood before. Interesting that the Green got 4,000 there, and you also have an independent running. You also have a guy from the Monster Raven Lunatic Party called Nick the Incredible Flying Brick. That looks like fun. But we will now turn to a couple of other things, because I want to, again, demonstrate a point, which is that this crew here this is not a popular group at all. So I'm now going to show you Ilford North. And again, this is a place in London, which London is not a place I particularly care for, but other people tell me it's important. So here we have the revolting homunculus, Wesley Streeting, who just about, as you can see here, manages to hang on to his seat with 15,647 votes against an independent challenger called Liane Mohammed. And she got 15,119. So he hangs on to his seats by just over 500 votes. Interestingly enough, if the Green there, who doesn't look like she ever stood a chance, had withdrawn in Liane Mohammed's favour, then maybe she could have got over the top and ejected Streeting. It doesn't matter too much. I mean, to get focused, people think that if Streeting got kicked out, then the privatisation of the NHS would stop. No, it wouldn't. It's happening because it's a demand of the ruling class. Wesley Streeting is just their chosen instrument. So that's an interesting result there, showing clearly that the independents who were standing on a pro-Palestine platform were doing very well. And also that the enthusiasm just isn't there, because back in 1997, admittedly, there wasn't any open wars as there is right now, but there was things to challenge British imperialism on. Israel was still doing some horrendous shit, maybe not quite as much as it is now. But again, the wave of enthusiasm and positivity that was there, however fake it was in 1997, is just not there. Like, Streeting's hung on there because of a Labour core vote, just as Starmer did. For a prime minister, incoming prime minister, who's meant to be getting this enormous majority, to have his majority slashed like that is, I think, unprecedented. So let's go back again and dive into some more results. And here I will show you some more points about, like, well, just what is it that the happens to the Conservative vote, and to get an indication of like what's happened here, I'm going to dive into some places in the southwest of England, which I'm not even convinced are real. This is like Hobbit country shit, you know. This is a constituency called Frome in East Somerset. I'm told it's real, so let's go. Here we go. Southwest of England, if you're not familiar with it, joking about Tolkien characters aside, it's a rural area. It's you have to sort of understand some of the regional divisions in England in particular to sort of grasp the what goes on in the elections. There is a cliche that those of us in the north which is where I'm from originally, like to hold over people from the south, and it's something we should probably not do outside of a pub, but we lean into it sometimes. It comes from the idea that the south is where all the rich people live, the northwest is where all the the workers in their clogs shuffling down cobbled streets, going inside a cold grey slate grey house at the end of the day, having done 57 hours a day in a mill, and then putting your feet up in front of a fire made out of old bacon rinds or something. And in the south, they all live like a Regency costume drama. Of course, this is nonsense. Generally reflects a certain sort of perhaps a certain sort of reality is at the core of this joke, which is that in the Industrial Revolution, a lot of the wealth of the country was being generated in the mills and the factories and the mines of the north, and there was a slightly less of an emphasis on the south. With financialization that comes through the maturing of capitalism to its imperialist stage and the development of monopoly capitalism, you see the wealth start to shift. So the balance of forces within the bourgeois shifts from being more in the north to being, with the industrial bourgeois, to more in the south with the merchant and the banking bourgeois in the city of London again, which is of course where they emerged from in the first place. If you go back, and again we go back to the period of the English Revolution, it was merchant capital and banking capital that actually was the basis upon which the bourgeois were built in this country, and the basis upon which the rebellion was waged against Charles I. So it was kind of like circled back to itself. But I digress slightly. So the southwest of the country, again, like, you shouldn't be fooled by like the fact that a lot of these places return Tory MPs or Liberal MPs. Southwest and the southeast have a lot of poor areas in them, and again, I've been to quite a lot of these places over the years, both to visit other people and sometimes for like camping holidays. You go through these places, particularly if you're driving, and you can see a lot of these places have been hollowed out, particularly in the rural areas. There's an awful lot of rural poverty in England, Wales, and Scotland that never really gets addressed. So the regional cliches aside, it's always more mixed than the regional cliches would allow for, in terms of the level of poverty, the number of working class people who live in each area. But what is generally the case is that in a lot of these seats in the southwest and southeast, there are, perhaps proportionally speaking, more richer people, but it's also the case that there is, again, a lot of poverty, a lot of poorer end working class people live here. We now get to the analysis of the results. So this was won by a Liberal Democrat woman called Anna Sabine, who gets 16,580 votes. That's a 12% jump from last time. Lucy Trimmel, the former Conservative occupant of this seat, loses 25% of her previous vote. A man called David Swain from Reform UK, Farage's group, gains 6,441. So if you look here, now this won't be an exact match, it never is, but you can see, broadly speaking, where the votes of the Conservative Party have gone. They've drained away to Reform, allowing the Liberal Democrats, who did get a boost to their vote here, but it's fair to say wouldn't have won without that Conservative and Reform Party split. So we will move on and look at a couple of other places to give you an indication of what has gone on here. And that pattern you see there, I'm going to just pick out another couple of seats so I can give you a clearer demonstration of what has happened. So let's go and find somewhere else to look at. Let's look at Clacton. Our old friend Nigel has won here. And unlike many on the idiot end of the British left, I don't think Nigel Farage is a fascist. I think he's a fairly standard British Conservative who would have been happily in the Tory party until about 30 years ago. So here, you can see Nigel Farage from Reform UK, gets 46.2% of the vote and 21,225. The Giles Watling character from the Conservatives gets 12,820, a 44% drop in the vote. So again, here you can make a direct comparison. It's here it's obvious, fairly obvious what has happened, which is the bulk of that Tory vote from 2019 has gone straight over to Nigel Farage. And again, Clacton's one of those interesting places. I went to a couple of, bizarrely, Trotskyite conferences there. It was an interesting place. It's got actually a rather nice beach to it. But there's a lot of poverty there. There's a lot of places that have just been left to rot. I'm not saying that that's where Farage's stronghold is. Generally, I think his voters are a sort of mixture of working class and petty bourgeois. I mean, here it's a case where the Conservative vote has just split, and a significant amount of it has gone to Farage. In fact, almost all of it which left has gone to Farage. Plus, he picks up some from elsewhere. There's been allegations that the Labour Party didn't try too hard in this seat. And why would they? If your principal opponent is going to lose to Farage, well, let them lose to Farage. So, Reform, as you've seen from the examples we've been picking out, has been hollowing out the Conservative vote in a number of places. Now let's turn to Scotland in this our feature presentation. And here we will turn to another of our old friends, the Scottish National Party. Now, here you can see quite clearly Labour has done very well in Scotland, and they have benefited. Again, you can see where the votes of the SNP have gone. Now, to explain the significance of this, I'll have to take you on a journey back to 10 years ago, maybe even longer. But 10 years ago, the Labour vote in Scotland started to come under extreme pressure, which came from the fact that there was another poor choice of David Cameron conceding the referendum that the Scottish National Party's leaders had long said that they desired. Now, remember, Labour conceded devolution to Scotland in 1999. This was set up. Now, I think this was a terrible idea. It was set up under a sort of wave of enthusiasm for constitutional reform, which the Labour Party and the sort of what I would call the soft middle-class left had taken up as some kind of magic bullet against Tory rule, as they saw it. It started to become something of an enthusiasm of theirs in the later 1980s, devolution. And I mean, there's no constitutional solution to the problems faced by the British working class under capitalism. I mean, you'll be fairly clear that that's my point of view if you've been watching this program for a while. But even just within the framework of the governance of a bourgeois country, like devolution in Britain is a fundamentally ridiculous idea. We're not that big a place. I know cartographers who were still basing their maps on the days of the British Empire like to absurdly overinflate the size of Britain sometimes, but it's a small island, very small. It's became shall we say, a seafaring country by necessity. And so devolution never made a whole lot of sense. It's one it has been a cohesive economic unit, even under capitalism. The problems faced by the working class are not problems of being Scottish or being Welsh. The problems faced from being in the working class on the receiving end of a class war that's been waged for over a generation. But anyway, devolution was given, and for the first decade, Labour dominated it. But then they became disgraced, and the SNP won out. Now, why did the SNP win? The SNP, if you trace their origins all the way back to the 1920s, started by people like Arthur Donaldson, who was a sort of closet fascist, sort of romantic, sort of romanticist figure. A lot of them in the early days of the SNP were, if not out and out fascists, then pretty close to it. Some of them thought that they might get appointed as Gauleiters of the northern part of Britain if the Nazis invaded. So that's where they come from. They, like many others in the 60s and 70s, carried out a social democratic turn. And so by the time they started to win, I mean, their big breakthrough was 67 when a woman called Winnie Ewing won a by-election up in Scotland. And they had more of a breakthrough in the 70s and then into the 80s. And they did this by, as Labour became more and more openly pro-capitalist and sort of abandoning the reformist path completely, the SNP moved into bits of the territory that the Labour Party had abandoned. And they were able to find quite a considerable degree of success doing this under Alex Salmond, who, for all that I politically despise the man, was a skillful bourgeois politician. And his time in charge of the SNP saw them to go forward quite considerably. Now, they did this whilst talking a left game on the one hand, but adapting themselves endlessly to the demands of the ruling class on the other. So they would say that they were like basically like one iota to the left of Labour. But then you examined Salmond's actual economic plans for Scottish independence, and it was basically that they were going to turn Scotland into a tax haven. They were going to try and get into NATO. They were going to try and get into the EU. And this is all written. I wrote all this up in an article that I published a while ago. I will put it back on the Telegram group so people can see it. So the details are all in there. So they ran to the left of Labour successfully. And what happened was, after about 2009, they really started drawing in a lot of the, what I would call the petty bourgeois leftist voting base of the Labour Party, got drawn over to the SNP. And then you really have an explosion of delusions in 2014 when David Cameron, as I said, granted the independence vote. And he did so on the basis that this was going to be something which he would easily win. Now, in the end, it was a 10% victory, and the SNP lost. But there were polls beforehand which said it was going to be a narrow win for the SNP, which I don't think the SNP ever really wanted, by the way. I think the whole game of the SNP leadership was to essentially like their equivalents in Catalonia, who didn't really want independence either. People like Carles Puigdemont, the guy who was nominally in charge of the referendum campaign a few years ago. I think it was 2018. And as soon as they won that, got on a plane and fucked off. Him and a bunch of other leaders did, because they didn't really want it. What they wanted was a new bargain with the London government. And then the bargain was always going to be that they get a bigger budget from the London government and they get more power over more devolved policy areas, but they don't actually want independence. It's not something that they actually wanted ever to really do. Now, I think that's the case with Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond's successor. Salmond himself, maybe he did. That's to be fair. But I don't think Sturgeon was interested in it. I don't think her successor, Humza Yousaf, was interested in it. I don't think his successor, John Swinney, was interested in it. Because, again, this is difficult stuff. You've got to now build a nation that's been an integral part of another nation for 300 years and has been economically incorporated into it probably for 500, 600. So the crowns in Britain were unified with James I of England and VI of Scotland. That's in the early 17th century. The Act of Union comes a century later after the English Civil War and Revolutions in 1707. So they've really been part of one polity for 400 years, over 400 years. And again, the links between England and Scotland are very extensive, going back to the times of the Roman occupation or just immediately afterwards. So this is going to be a very difficult thing to undo. So it's something that you could understand why some of these politicians just didn't want to get in the business of that. What they wanted was to be able to play at running a state. And that's what Nicola Sturgeon was good at. She was good at playing at running a state. So they gain a great deal of credibility when they lose the referendum campaign in 2014. And what happens is, a lot of the soft left, the middle class left in Scotland, the people with the stupidest and the weirdest ideas in Britain, all run to the Scottish National Party. It gets this huge boost in the membership numbers in 2014. I think at one stage it got up to being over 100,000 people were in it. So this became a mass party. Now, why does it become a mass party? Again, it becomes a mass party because of the draining of support away from the Labour Party for very deserved reasons, and the feeling that the SNP were the progressive left vehicle for people to join, and that they offered a way forward away from perpetual rule by the Tories and the evil rich English of the South. And this is a delusion, of course, but I don't necessarily blame people for engaging in it. The state of play in British politics is dire and has been for a long time. So people seizing on anything that comes past thinking it's oppositional, I can understand that. We've all gone through that, but the SNP was not the vehicle to choose. So they get over 100,000 members suddenly. Everybody who wants to oppose the status quo in Scotland joins the SNP. They go into the 2015 election and they win big time. They almost wipe the Labour Party out in terms of seats in Scotland. They, strangely enough, they allowed the Tory party to come back because they'd been wiped out in Scotland in 1997. But SNP in 2015 have unparalleled power in Scottish terms. They could have forced another independence referendum, but they never did. Because again, they're not interested in actually getting it. And Nicola Sturgeon takes over from Alex Salmond. They then proceed to tear themselves apart in 50 different ways. They start fighting with each other. Salmond is accused of sexual harassment, and sexual assault claims are brought against him. This goes to court in Scotland, and some of his old party comrades turn on him. He ultimately gets off with this. And I think part of the reason, if I'm remembering this rightly, was that Nicola Sturgeon and her husband had been trying to intervene and get witnesses to amp up their testimony further. So Salmond was accused of some very dubious Louis C.K., shall we say, type activities. I won't go into the gory details. So clearly he sort of admitted that he'd got up to no good with regard to his Louis C.K.-like activities. So that would have been enough to disgrace him. But for some reason, Sturgeon and others in the hierarchy of the SNP, and this was documented by Craig Murray, the guy who ran unsuccessfully for the Workers' Party up in Blackburn. They were in a WhatsApp group together, or at least the SNP hierarchy, trying to come up with ways to sort of add to the accusations against him. Now, being accused of some, shall we say, Louis C.K. type activity in front of various different women, that should be bad enough to fuck you like Caligula's favourite watermelon, career-wise. Apparently it's not, though. So Salmond, though, got disgraced, but he ultimately he got off of the charge, and he founds a new party, Albion, which seems to have sunk without trace this time around. Maybe they're focusing their fire on the Scottish elections, the next Scottish Assembly elections. But anyway, so they get damaged. Their reputation gets damaged through that. The failure to enact another independence referendum after they'd made this big show that they were going to do it after the Brexit referendum, because Scotland voted to stay in the EU, but not by a considerable margin, but by 60-40. So that's sizable, but it's not gigantic. You're not looking like 80-20 or 90-10. That's still 40-odd% of the electorate that turned out in Scotland voted to leave the EU in line with England. So Sturgeon was claiming that it was this great moment that they were going to, now is the time when we will declare independence and march off into a European dawn. With apologies to any Scots watching for my rather atrocious accent. You wouldn't believe that my family origins came from there originally. But the point I'm making with this rather elongated story that I'm enumerating to you is that the SNP went up like a rocket and down like a stick. They talked this big game about a new referendum, and then they started falling out with each other. Then the Salmond wing left. They lost a number of their Westminster MPs who defected to Salmond's new party, Alba. They got involved in a series of scandals, which more in just a moment. And there were splits emerging all over the place. And then it emerged thanks to there's a Freedom of Information request put in by a guy who goes by the name of Campbell, who runs the Wings Over Scotland blog. And he requested information on what preparation had been made for a new independence campaign. And strangely enough, they allowed his request to go through under the Freedom of Information laws. And it came back that there was no plans in place at all. It was all just a big talking shop, all just a big game, because Sturgeon just wanted to barter with, I believe it was Johnson at the time, first Theresa May, then Boris Johnson, about getting more powers for the Scottish Assembly and a bigger budget. That's what it's always been about. Hoarding power and, of course, money, and building yourself up a patronage network, which you can then use to maintain your control, which is what the Scottish National Party were doing. Now on to the other scandals involving the SNP, and this involves, of course, a revisit to a topic of the show that we covered earlier this week, which is, of course, gender ideology. And one of the byproducts, the hideous byproducts of the Scottish National Party, being a home for what I can only call the terminally insane petty bourgeois Scottish left, is that all of their most noxious ideas became policy. And one of those noxious ideas is, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea if we put men who are perhaps in prison for all kinds of offences, including sex offences, wouldn't it be a great idea if we just allowed these guys to self-identify as women and then be allowed to be transferred to a women's prison? Which is what happened. And guess what starts to happen? These men start to commit crimes against women, which is what some of them were in prison for in the first place. So self-identification, self-IDing yourself into womanhood, a ridiculous thing and a reactionary idea, led to Nicola Sturgeon's government transferring men who committed horrendously violent crimes or crimes of a sexual nature, or in some cases both, into women's prisons, whereby some of them promptly offended again. So this was the big idea, one of the big ideas of Nicola Sturgeon's party, and rightly it produced a wave of very public revulsion. And this is, of course, leads to it's all part of the tapestry, the rich tapestry of failure, which leads to a catastrophic defeat. Not that Labour is any better, of course, on any of the issues I've just mentioned, but they gain where the SNP loses. So a lot of people just transferred themselves back to the Labour Party, basically. And that's why they won so big in Scotland. And so I'm going to close that down now so we can expand the screen again. So this is the picture here, and I want to bringing this. I'll talk about the numbers here to a close. The picture here is that the Labour Party have won their majority thanks to a collapse of the Conservatives in England, brought about partially by the fact that they were just corrupt and despised, also partially by the fact that the Reform Party grabbed a lot of votes off them, but didn't break through enough to get any more than 4 seats themselves. And they got less votes, the Reform did, than UKIP did at their high water mark in 2015, I believe. So there's a clear, I think at the moment there is a clear ceiling on the appeal of Mr. Farage and co. Whether that ceiling will remain is another question. Now, the win that they have attained will be portrayed as this great mandate. It is nothing of the kind, as we've shown by going through the historic figures. This is a very fragile government built on very dubious foundations that is not in any way secure. It has nothing like the authority or the power of even the Blair governments of 97, 2001, and even 2005. It is not liked. Its leader is not popular. Many of their leading figures, as we've shown by going through the results here, almost lost their seats to pro-Palestine challengers. Had the election been called perhaps a little later, more of their number would have lost their seats. So this is an unpopular party coasting still on two things: the fumes of the period, the long forgotten, no, not forgotten, but the long past period of reform, 45 to 51, and the sheer unpopularity of the Conservative Party. But it's unpopularity of both major parties. Both major parties were fundamentally, not fundamentally changed, but like both major parties have been defined by the social democratic welfare capitalist period. The Labour Party by creating it, the Conservatives by fundamentally altering it. And what it shows is that there is a real crisis in the institutions of British capitalism. Comes from a rot within the foundation, the economic foundations itself, comes from a rotting British imperialism, which again is something which goes back much further. We're talking going back beyond a century now. But the reason why it's a century of decline is because, of course, Britain, as the first capitalist nation, was so far out ahead of its competitors that there's an awful lot of capital been accumulated in Britain, and there's an awful lot of decline to go through. We are now approaching the point of we have gone past the point of no return a long time ago now. But because you had this period of reform, it gave new life to British imperialism, unfortunately, and gave new legitimacy to the system. That's now run out. The working class has been looking for ways to get out of the situation. Brexit was seen as that by some. Corbyn was seen as that by some. Farage will be seen as that by some. All of which will, of course, or have already failed. And the working class will be brought face to face with the reality that only a re-emergence of class struggle will actually improve its position. Now, this is going through a process which, again, we will reference here the work of Stalin. When Stalin said it takes a while for the material reality to fully permeate into the consciousness, what we have here is whole new layers of the working class will be entering into class struggle, more than likely within the next year or so. And they will be entering into struggle because the Labour Party will not be able to deliver on even the tiny promises that it made. It will be a government of crisis, which is going to try and impose its will using this big majority it's got via the quirks of the electoral system, but which is not a majority based on actual enthusiasm. So it has no real enthusiasm amongst the population. It has, at best, the grudging consent of around about 1 in 6 of actual registered voters. So this is not a popular government. This is not a great and dynamic prime minister and leadership team who can sweep all before them. They're going to have to do some very dirty attacks on the working class, which the trade union leaders will try to help them carry out. But what is my forecast here, my speculation, if you will, is that we may see outbreaks of class struggle soon, which go beyond the control of the trade union leaders. Either the attacks on the working class are so severe that the trade union leaders can't stop potential wildcat action in some areas, or you see outbursts of struggle in areas which aren't actually represented by the existing trade unions. You see like walkouts, demonstrations, possibly even riots in some areas due to the cost of living crisis being as bad as it is. That's what we're in for. The long-term decay of British capitalism has been saved. The superstructure is hanging on by or being propped up by these shaky foundations, not because the ruling class is particularly strong, but because the working class is still not out of the long shadows of the defeats of the 1980s. And what we're faced with now is a situation where the imperialist system has decayed. Its legitimacy in terms of its political institutions, its ideological institutions, well, the institutions of ideological reproduction are also in a deep crisis. Like the media, despised by huge numbers of the population. I don't have to be a Marxist to despise it. Many people who vote reform or even the people who are apolitical despise the bourgeois press now. So that's a deep, deep crisis for the machinery of ideological reproduction. And so the institutions, as I was saying, so media, political institutions, cultural institutions, all become more and more despised as time goes on. The legitimacy of all of it comes into question. The thing that is preserving it is the fact that when the working class has moved thus far, it's moved in limited ways, in avenues that are within the system. And so when you see the working class emerge, even in a limited way, to conduct a more widespread class struggle, you will see the foundations really shake. Again, it is the British imperialist system now is held there domestically by the inertia of the working class. That's what's holding it there. The fact that we've not recovered from the defeats of 1985 to 87. The fact that the composition of the class has changed over time. The fact that organization has retreated, and the organizations that are there in the form of the trade unions their leadership is completely and thoroughly incorporated into the state. But class will out, Stalin observed. You have many people now who certainly weren't around in the last period of defeat, who weren't even around in the last period of the Labour government. Much younger workers going into the workforce who've only ever known pay cuts, who've only ever known like shit working conditions, and are now about to be told that it's going to get worse. And you have other workers who are maybe in the slightly better paid sections of the working class, who are maybe a bit older, maybe people my age, who went into the workforce around about 2008 to 2010, who have been told growing up that they're not working class, they're middle class, the amorphous middle class. But they certainly aren't going to be feeling it, with bills mounting up, with mortgage payments going through the roof, with an inability to even pay for the basics of life hitting them, despite the fact that they've been told that they're part of this great middle class now, which is sort of the great ideological scam of the Thatcher and post-Thatcher era. But suddenly a load of these people are going to be brought face to face with the realities that they're no better off than the people that they've been taught to disparage, who live in the housing association places round the corner from their overly expensive rental flats. So what you're about to see is that the bits of the working class that who have the most illusions are about to get hit in the face with the reality of their class position. Now, some will react with great irrationality and loathing because of that. Some will have to refound themselves, or re-find an instinct towards class politics and join the broader struggles of the working class. Again, material reality will have its way with you in the end, no matter how much credit you've borrowed, or no matter how many delusions you've fostered about your social position. Material reality always wins, ultimately, and your consciousness has to catch up with that. As Stalin observed when he was talking about the consciousness of the former petty bourgeois individual craftsman who's forced out of business and has to go to work in a factory. His consciousness ultimately does catch up with his material reality. A lot of other millions of workers are about to go through a similar trial and error situation in this country, which we've been going through already. Brexit, it was a working class revolt. Ultimately, it didn't work because you were asking the bourgeois political forces in the form of the Tories, would have been the same with Labour, to carry out an act which was fundamentally against the interests of the ruling class. Same with Scottish independence. You're asking a bourgeois party, the Scottish National Party, which is not really interested at all in building an independent nation, to defy the interests of the British ruling class and build something that would be genuinely sovereign. They were never going to do that. Same with Farage and reform. You're asking a man who would have been very happy in the Conservative Party as late as 89, 90, to essentially create some sort of uber Thatcherite Little England, which is, again, not going to work and is only going to have a very negative impact upon the life and living standards of the working class. But again, these are all sort of abortive thrusts in various different directions that bits of the working class take as the working class looks for a way out of the impasse, of the decaying Labour Party, of the working class's diminishing pay and conditions, of the diminishing life chances, of the decay of their communities, of the fact that their children are going to lead more harsher lives than they have done, and the fact that round the corner is what is facing the Greek working class, 6-day weeks, 120-hour weeks. This is what the capitalists ultimately have in store. And the working class will have to rediscover the road of struggle, even those layers that haven't engaged in it yet, even those generations which have no concept of it. If all of those, as I said, all of those delusions put in our minds about everybody being middle class now, about everybody, about Britain overcoming class conflict, all those kind of things, those will all be stripped away. And what we will be faced with when we will see when the working class starts to move in a more generalized sense is just how weak the state structures in the institutions are, and just how quickly many of the petty bourgeois, the actual petty bourgeois, who've been screaming about saving democracy for a few years, will flip and want to find themselves a duce pretty soon. Right, I'll pause there and take questions and comments. Well, we have rather a lot. Okay, James Graham, good afternoon to you. With due apologies for the Scottish accent. Robeson joins us from Jakarta. Todd joins us from the forests of northern New Mexico. Agitate says fraternal greetings, and I say fraternal greetings back to you. Lee joins us, as does Jay, who's sneaking in whilst at work. Zuleika is with us, as is Ken Jack, who says, "Who is that tenor?" Well, I think you were referring to the Ukrainian national anthem as it was under the Soviet period. So I don't know who that is, but I'll post up the song in the on the Telegram group so you can see it. Matt joins us, as does Jawad. Good afternoon to you, comrade. Almir joins us. Kobe is with us and hopes that Labour will be a one-term government. Well, we can all hope that. Paul Mason joins us and says, "Greetings. A horrible rumour emanating from South Bank suggests I may be considered for the post of ambassador to Minsk." Well, you should go. It's a great place. At least that's what I'm told. HM points out with regard to Ilford North, the Greens acted as spoilers. They saved Wes Streeting. Yeah, the Greens did that in quite a number of places. I mean, I don't know what the conversations were between the Liane Mohammed campaign and the Greens, but certainly if it was the case that the Greens wanted to see the back of Wesley Streeting, then they should have withdrawn and endorsed her if she had the better chance of winning. Now, I'm not saying that as somebody who has a great belief in that the kind of politics that Liane Mohammed and others represent is particularly good. I mean, after all, her campaign was endorsed by Owen Jones. I mean, I know we shouldn't damn people with their associations, but given that man's reputation, maybe we should. But even so, getting rid of Wesley Streeting would have been funny, and it would have put a small spanner in the works of Keir Starmer's plans. As it was, they lost that vile little rat, Jonathan Ashworth, in Leicester South, again to a pro-Palestine candidate. There were 4, I'll just go through this now quickly, pro-Palestine candidates who won in the election, just passed. And they won from like outside of organized political parties. Usually these were people who had pre-established reputations in the area. I think a lot of them, a number of them might have been councillors, or who had they had local networks that they tapped into that some of the WPB Workers' Party candidates didn't have. So again, like where an independent comes from seemingly comes from nowhere to win, generally there's somebody who's had like enough of a local network already in existence that they could tap into. So you have Shokat Adam in Leicester South, who got rid of the little rat Ashworth. You have Iqbal Mohammed, who won as an independent in Dewsbury and Batley. You have Adnan Hussein up in Blackburn. You have Corbyn, of course, in Islington North, about whom more in just a moment. And you have Ayub Khan in Birmingham Perry Bar. So that's quite something in terms of individuals breaking through as independents. Exactly what happens with that, with those characters and what they do with those wins is another question entirely. But we move on with your comments. If I can just call that up again. Yes, there we go. Salon says Workers' Party got like 240,000. I'll have to check on that, the exact numbers there. Sean joined us from Cornwall. Good afternoon to you. Irish Partisan says, greetings, comrades, and commiserations to all of you dwell in perfidious Albion. Yes, well, I may take that holiday in Minsk after all. But good to have you with us, comrade. HM says, mind a point, but 2019 was a winter election and a miserable rainy day, and Labour still got more people out than now. Yeah, that's very true. Even with the compromised mess that was the 2019 Labour campaign, they still got more votes than than Keir Starmer did now. Rupert says, Sunak carried out the US directive and successfully handed over power to the new puppet. Mike Pompeo gave the order to take Corbyn down with the false anti-Semitism allegations. Says Rupert, well, Pompeo was involved, but these allegations and that campaign started before Trump took office. Those allegations started, and I remember it distinctly, when Corbyn was running as a candidate for the leadership. That was before Trump won. This is not even into 2016. This is late summer of 2015 when these started, because I remember him being hectored by Kathy Newman on Channel 4 News about it. So Pompeo had a role later on, he said in his usual crude style that there's no way we're going to let Corbyn take over. It'll be against our interests. I can't do a Mike Pompeo impression, so I'm doing an impression of a sort of ersatz Clint Eastwood. But yes, it was a campaign that was begun domestically, and it wasn't Pompeo who started it. It was started very much here, with the influence, of course, of the Israeli government. Svetlana joins us from Moscow. Good to have you with us. HM says the media are desperately trying to explain the way Labour's poor numbers by people staying home because they thought Labour would win anyway in tactical voting. Yeah, the media is going to try and bullshit you into thinking that Keir Starmer is popular because, well, this is what they've been told to do. They're trying to warm people up so that they will accept the attacks that are to come because they're from an overwhelmingly popular Prime Minister, which, of course, he is not. Rupert says, if you want to deliberately throw an election, just promise national conscription with the threat of being sent to the Eastern Front. They'd have lost regardless, Rupert, to your point. They were always going to lose a lot of seats, but I don't think that moved the needle, to be honest. If you look at the amount of votes that Reform took off them, what really won this election for the Labour Party was partially the collapse of the SNP, deserved collapse, I must say, repeat that again, but the fact that Reform took so many votes off the Conservatives. And again, that you can prove that by just looking at the statistics and seeing the fact that the Conservative vote went down by like 20 points and Reform's vote goes up by 18, 19. It's obvious what's happened there. It was Reform's entry into the race which swung it. If the Reform hadn't been led by Farage and hadn't been bigged up massively in the media as the voice of opposition, remember, until recently, until yesterday, or this morning, I should say, Farage wasn't an MP. Galloway was. Galloway was MP for Rochdale. He lost that seat, as we covered last night. So why was Farage in all the debates? Purely on poll performance? I don't think it was that. He's promoted, and he's promoted for a number of reasons, and we might as well cover this now. He's promoted partially because he has and has always had certainly for the last 15 years or so, a level of support within certain areas of the ruling class. And because he's got a level of support within certain areas of certain sections of the ruling class, the media pick up on that and treat him as a legitimate figure. And he was, of course, a Euro MP for many years, but, so was Nick Griffin. But Farage has been around a long time, so that gives him a certain credo. But it is because ultimately he's a man who picks up support from the lower bourgeois and certain elements in the petty bourgeois. He's considered to be acceptable for those reasons. For more cynical reasons, he's promoted as an acceptable alternative because they know very well that there's a certain ceiling on his support at this stage. I can never see Farage winning. I can see a new version of reform that merges with the Conservatives coming back in 2029 to win. Certainly that's the case. But it was their entry which really did in the Conservatives this time around. And ultimately, I think that what the Rishi Sunak tactic was to just preserve the core areas, knowing that they were going to lose with the entry of Farage into the game. Just try to scare enough votes out as possible, preserve the core areas, then reconfigure the party afterwards. And that tactic seems to have worked. The tactic of getting Farage into the game, of course, was pursued by numerous people with different agendas. Again, nothing ever happens for just one reason. So there was numerous people who wanted Farage to get into the game. You have the people who support him anyway, who support his agenda. That's a minority of the ruling class and certain sections of the petty bourgeois. You have other more cynical actors who really wanted a Labour Party win. And so you have to hollow out the Conservative vote. Best way to do that, get Farage in the game, big up reform, big up their numbers as much as you can. Remember, the predictions of reform's performance and their actual performance were kind of out of whack with each other. At certain points, reform were predicted to get like 21 or 22 points. They got 7 points below that in the end and got less votes than UKIP did in 2015. So this is something which is, of course, based on a certain amount of support for the appearance of a much harder line on immigration, and of course a certain degree of popularity that Farage generated for his long support for Brexit. But ultimately, this is something which is largely a media creation, as it was back in the day as well. There's elements of reality there, but they've been pushed as hard as they have and declared to be the real opposition party because of the various agendas of different elements of the ruling class. That's behind the popularity of reform. 4 images more says that I should do stand-up. I did stand-up poetry once. I will never do it again. Grassy Knoll joins us from Seattle, Washington. We're teaching the Pixies Marxism, says Sean. Oh, of course, you're a man who's coming to us from the Southwest. Well, good on you. We hope to have a full-scale Hobbit rebellion by 2029. We have also we have Svetlana, who says, didn't the southwest of England take part heavily in the Monmouth rebellion? Do you remember reading about some awful character called Judge Jeffreys? Yes, this was a rebellion in the Middle Ages. I'm not that well up on it, but there's also been attempts at southwesterly independence movements or Devonian independence movements even in the past, coming out of the crushing of the Monmouth Rebellion and other things. But like everywhere else in Britain, the history of violence, direct violence and direct warfare in this country is buried at least 300 years ago, but it's still, the scars of it are still there if you peel back the surface. The Southwest was the last place in Britain to send a people's army against the London Parliament. Good point, from Sean in the Southwest. Jason joins us and says, greetings, comrades. What a depressing Friday it's turned out to be. Yeah, I get it, comrade, but I think there's gold to be had amongst the sewage, which is an appropriate metaphor for this moment. Irish Partisan says the CPB, that's the fake Communist Party of Britain, got 2,622 votes, winning, just narrowly beating the Climate Party to squeeze into 33rd position. Yeah, well, their actual position was to endorse Labour. The CPB always do this. They always stand some no-hoper candidates, get thrashed, and then the reality of their position is that they endorse Labour. It was more difficult for them this time because so many independents were standing and Galloway and the WPB were standing. But if you read their actual position written by their eminence grise, Andrew Murray, their position was that they backed Labour. They were not saying it so forcefully as they have done in the past, but their position was still vote Labour wherever you can. They were trying to soft pedal that a little bit, but again, that is still their position because they're a party of the trade union bureaucracy, and the trade union bureaucracy backs the Labour Party. So the party of the trade union bureaucracy runs along behind them. Scrolling down here. Does the SNP have a noose as its symbol? Asks President Jesus. I'm not sure if it's a noose. It's some sort of like Scottish symbol. I'm not familiar with what it is, but it might as well be. Though it's a noose now that they've inserted their own neck in. James Goblin joins us from Belgrade. Kobe says Scotland has resources. Obviously, England manoeuvred the way for Scotland not to gain independence, and through help of the media and planting framing incidents, England doesn't want to lose Scotland. Well, the fact is that the SNP didn't want to leave either. And it was, by the way, England's got resources. They're just not extracted. Scotland's got oil. That's true. And a big part of the SNP's leaving plan was based on that. But England's got resources. There's still fuckloads of coal under the surface of the English hills. There's still even gold and tin to be mined. There's still quarries in this country. The idea that England is without resources is a silly one. And the SNP are a corrupt bunch of double-dealing bastards. So if you had any faith in them, then you were severely mistaken. Nothing wrong with making a mistake, but one shouldn't persist in it. Why are they all named after fish? Says Harold. It's a good question, Harold. Sturgeon, salmon, trout, etc. Don't know the answer to that one, mate. Is there anything about the British character which prevents it from voting outside the Labour Conservative paradigm? I sense that Brits, in the words of W.H. Auden, cling on to the average day. No, look, there's a lot of... I mean, I understand why a lot of people from overseas don't understand why these two completely horrific political parties keep turning up. But you have to bear in mind that the Conservatives have been around for a long time. They are the traditional party of British capitalism, especially since the disappearance of the Liberals 100 years ago, or the disappearance of that version of the Liberals. But again, like you have to understand why the Labour Party persists, and it's fading. It's if you look at those results I read out earlier, from a position 30 years ago where it had 11 million votes and it lost, to a position where it's got 9 million votes and it manages to win. The system keeps them there because the system artificially inflates these parties. Also, like, this is a bourgeois democracy, and it's the oldest bourgeois democracy in many respects, in that the bourgeoisie is the most practiced at manipulating it. And so they set the tone. I mean, the ruling ideas in any epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. So the entire bourgeois media setup in this country promotes two parties, Labour and Conservative, maybe the SNP a little bit in Scotland, and Reform these days as well. But that's what Labour Conservative is, what you are presented with from the day of your birth, to the moment you become conscious, to the day you can go to the polling booth. Most people see it as a choice between Labour and Conservative, with maybe the Liberals getting a look in certain areas of the country. And so that's why they have that stability. Again, it's because it's portrayed as that's literally your only choice. That and the Labour Party has, again, you have to factor in why it's popular. It's popular because of things it did 75 years ago, which had a long-lasting impact. Like the National Health Service has a long-lasting impact. The certain changes to the legal system, the education system, etc. All of this like did create a generation that was quite genuinely better off. In some cases, in some areas, it was two generations that were better off than those who had come before the war and were able to live slightly better lives than their parents and grandparents did. And that was ascribed to the actions of the Labour Party. Now, as you'll know, if you've watched this channel for some time, there's very specific reasons for all of those concessions, and there's very specific reasons why they were ultimately eroded and many of them withdrawn. But the fact is that the things did change a lot from 1945 to 1951. And even with all the crimes and all the ridiculous things that the Labour Party's done and all its anti-worker and anti-communist nature, because the British Communist Party failed and sold out and became social democratic, that when there's been times when that Labour Party's hold could have been broken, it hasn't been. And so people keep defaulting back to it again. So again, bear in mind what I said. You have a situation where the residual hold that these parties have is ever diminishing. But because we haven't had a communist party that could successfully set itself up as a vanguard to break the hold of social democracy, this is why it holds on. There's been various opportunities in the 60s and 70s, even perhaps into the early 80s, where the Labour Party's hold could have been broken, or at least damaged severely. And it wasn't because of the actions of the Communist Party of Great Britain. So that's the biggest reason why the Labour Party hangs on, is because it has never been seriously challenged in its hold over the working class. The working class started to drift away in 1966 onward, from 1966 onwards. But again, they held enough residual power within the working class, propped up by the trade union leaders, to keep drawing in enough votes to get them over the line and to keep them as the number two party. That's starting to diminish now. But no, it's not something about the British character. There are effects of us being the oldest capitalist nation and the oldest imperialist nation. There is a certain effect that has, but none of this makes it so that we can't break out of it. Like I say, there's been various times when a break could have been made and wasn't. And we may be revisiting some of those in future episodes. Zuleika apparently likes the Scottish accent. Well, I'll have to bring it back at some point in the future then. Tim Gray says, the SNP positioned themselves to the left of Labour in the early 2010s. The Indie vote highlighted just how right-wing Labour were, and the SNP sucked up all the progressive votes. That's very true. Muzzle Paint, good afternoon to you. And okay. Jason says, the Scottish Parliament voted through the changes to the Gender Recognition Act that would have meant that a person would be illegally a woman in Scotland, cross the border and into England and turn into a man. Well, that is where self-identification takes you. What if he stands halfway between the two? What if he goes to Gretna Green? If he stands 1 foot in Scotland and 1 foot in England, can he legally marry himself? These are questions that we would have had to have handled in an independent Scotland. Margaret says, my Nicola Sturgeon impression sounded like a Dalek. Okay, that kind of worked out then. Jason says, I think the next 5 years will mark the death knell of modern trade union movement as workers reject the crap shoveled by their union leaders and organise themselves. I think what we'll see is that there will be a fundamental change, because the situation of the class demands a fundamental change. Like, you can't carry on like this. You can't carry on with like people being in unions which don't do anything, which sell out every single struggle, and also with millions and millions of workers outside of the unions and being fucked over relentlessly. Class struggle will emerge whether the union leaders want it to or not, and either they move or they'll be left behind by it, or they'll be swept away by a new wave of it. And you know what, Jason, you were mentioning earlier the negative mood. I see that as, and I'm sure you would agree, as this is the positive side of it, that things are getting to the point where there will be a sweeping of the decks here. Well, Rupert, the nameless suits have been in charge for a very long time. David joins us from the hotbed of Plaid Cymru. Sean says the right wing of the working class has no uniting political philosophy and are generally politically ignorant. Yeah, well, that generally goes for a lot of the left wing of the working class as well, unfortunately. Battle Cossack asks, thoughts on the victory of Le Pen in France? I think it's because of her opposition to send more money and guns to Ukraine. Do you think she's going to fulfill her promises? No. We'll cover the French election tomorrow, I think. We've got a French election and an Iranian election to cover. So it's a real election fever at the moment. The right will take anti-war positions, and then they'll get into power and they'll crumble as much as the left does. That's what happens in Europe. Carolus Maximus says, I'm sad the sword lady, that's Penny Mordaunt, lost her seat. She had all the qualifications to be a future PM. She's hot, she sounds posh, and she can keep a straight face while dressed like a clown and holding a sword. It's a good point. Because she has all those qualifications, she'll be back. Trust me. The ruling class, some elements of the ruling class clearly like her and fancy her to be a future Conservative leader. So they will find a way to bring her back into Parliament. They'll force out some bozo Conservative MP, give him a title, and put her back in. Zargo 5's points about Labour benefiting from holding election early. Look, I will repeat my point that I made earlier. The biggest factor, there's several factors. I mean, there's the sheer unpopularity of the Conservatives is one thing. Labour winning was the most likely outcome. Labour winning this by this much was the desired outcome of the ruling class, and they got that by putting Farage on the board. Again, Farage has his own reasons, etc. But the fact is that without his intervention, this would not have been possible to put Keir Starmer in the position that he's in, with a near unbreakable majority based on a very, very shallow, very, very weak vote. Overall percentage turnout, Zarg, was 60-odd%, I think. Let me just have a look at that and make sure I've checked that. 59.9%. Michael's noticed that I have James Connolly bookmarked. Well, you always should. Anybody who wants to understand anything about the nature of the history of Britain and Ireland should read all of the works of the great man himself. Labour in Australia has a primary vote of 31%, says Joe Harvey. What's under their kilt? Well, apparently certain women did find out what's under Alex Salmond's kilt, and that's not a pleasant experience. Healthy Harold joins us from Australia. Michael says, Connolly et al. Are turning in their graves at what the free state they died for has become. Well, that's very true. We'll have to go back and do a Connolly program at some point. More time needed, says Labour won 63% of the seats with 34% of the votes. Yeah, and there you go. Now, Rishi will be off to the great Silicon Valley experience as soon as he can possibly get out of here. But this, I will now come back to just one final word. And the final word I will have on this will be about Corbyn, who, of course, won his seat in London. Corbyn won his seat because, again, he's got name recognition. He was able to turn out like a lot of the London left to campaign for him. So they got a lot of canvassing done that other candidates couldn't do. He got a certain degree of union backing. So there is all of that. Now, this will excite the petty bourgeois left because they suddenly think that Corbyn's going to lead them somewhere. Corbyn's going to do exactly what he's always done, which is promise to do something and then do nothing. His whole thing is that he's a fake rebel. Like the number of times, I mean, I went through last night why his government can never work, but just to add to that today, like the point here is that he's won that seat, but he could have branched off and started his own party 4 years ago. Could have done that. He could have conceivably walked out of the Labour Party when they couped him in 2016 and said, fuck this. This is a joke. These people will not allow me to run anything. I'm walking out. Could have, and I'm inviting you all to join me. That would have got a huge response. Could have done it in immediately after Starmer booted him in 2020. Could have walked and spilled the beans and told everybody everything. But he doesn't for various different reasons. One is that he's a Labour man to the bitter fucking end. The other one is that his various friends and political allies in the Labour Party and the trade union leadership would have prevailed upon him not to rock the vote and not to rock the boat. And then the other reason is he's perfectly happy just being a small-time backbench MP. Doesn't want to be the leader of anything and never really did. And so, but the petty bourgeois left insist upon getting excited about things which don't merit it. So they'll spend the next few years getting excited and thinking that the great St. Jeremy of Islington is going to lead them out of the desert into the promised land. And of course he won't. So stop looking to Corbyn to lead anything. He's not going to. Write to him if you've got a problem in your constituency. I hear he's probably quite good, and I mean this quite genuinely, he's quite good at actually sorting out constituents' problems. He's not the leader of anything, though, nor is he ever going to be now. So for God's sake, stop saying that he is. He's proved he doesn't want it. Move on, okay? Leave it behind. Stop thinking that he's going to sort of magic up some new social democratic party out of nothing. We've covered this many times before, but I will reiterate. The time for social democracy is gone. The moment passed 70 years ago, and it's not coming back. Now we are faced with a situation where there will be numerous attempts now to build on the near misses of the social democratic anti-war candidates. And, you know, they may pull something together out of the remains of the WPB and other things. Generally speaking, now I have no faith in the ability of the petty bourgeois left to organise a piss-up in an off-licence, and never mind a political party. The task for us as communists is a different one. As I said last night, the task for us is to find and start the process of political education for as many good potential communists within the working class and more widely as possible. To start the process of rooting the Communist Party in working class communities, to start the process of getting people to act as communists within the union movement and within the wider working class. That's the task for us now. It is a task which is important, but which starts on a small scale. But this is where we are. And it is less flashy and more difficult. But it is ultimately the task that we will rebuild a proper nationwide vanguard party through doing this difficult task. And so it is to organisation that we must now turn. And I'll be talking more about organisation in future programmes. Enquiring Mind on Twitter, or X, asks the question, 14 ex-military men were parachuted in as Labour candidates. Is this a move towards conscription and British boots on the ground in Ukraine? No, it's not. The reason why they parachuted in a bunch of ex-military and spies into the Labour Party is because Starmer is a sad little bastard who thinks this impresses people. It makes him look tough by association. The reason why there's not going to be British boots on the ground, and I fucking hate that term, by the way. Not having a go at you for using it. I just don't like the term. Why there won't be a formal British deployment to Ukraine is because the British Army couldn't possibly sustain it. The reason why that Sunak's national service plan was always a pipe dream was because they don't have the industrial base to actually equip a large army. Even Sunak's plan, it would have taken like years and years to build up the kind of force that could have been deployed to Ukraine. By the time a British army could have been deployed, which would stand half a chance of standing up to the Russians for longer than a week, would be ready, it would be like 5 years from now. The war will be over by then. What's happening now is that there's manoeuvring amongst everybody to try and find a negotiated settlement. Now, this manoeuvring is going to go on for quite some time, and unfortunately, many, many thousands more Ukrainians will die in the meantime. There's a reason why Viktor Orban is in Moscow right now, having been in Kiev. Yes, Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel and Josep Borrell and all the other crackpots who are supposed to be in charge of the EU, but in reality are just puppets of one imperialist power or another, are all complaining. But Orban's not stupid. He would not have gone to Kiev and certainly wouldn't have gone to Moscow if he didn't have the tacit consent of certain people. And I think he's got the tacit consent, unspoken, of Schultz and Macron. I also think he's maybe had the nod being given to him by some elements within the US government. As we know, there's not a central controlling element there at the moment because the president's brain is missing. But he's gone to Moscow with, if not a direct mandate, but with a nod and a wink from certain people in the EU, within the European countries, and maybe within the United States, to talk to Putin about what would actually be an acceptable settlement. That's what he's gone there for. And he can do that because he's kept kept relations open. As I suspect, it's not just that he sees it as in his interest to do so, even though that's the case. I think there are people within Europe that are perfectly happy for him to keep that avenue open, because it means that a European leader can go and talk directly to Putin without them getting into internal political trouble. So that's the role that Orban's playing here. So this is already being talked about. This is already discussed behind closed doors as to how they're going to settle this. So no, there's not going to be a direct British deployment. The Brits, the United States, the French, and others have quite a number of people who've been killed in Ukraine. So, for instance, there was a Marine Corps ex-general who suddenly went to Ukraine, came back, and suddenly died as soon as he arrived in the United States. And if you believe that story, you'll believe anything. Zuleika says, there aren't many good constituency MPs, so I'm glad he stayed, but he is toothless like an aged chihuahua. Yes. But people do insist on seeing things that aren't there, Zuleika. Kobe says, the media internal force did a lot of damage on Corbyn. The British ruling class isn't interested in reinstalling social democracy. It's long gone. However, at these times, they view it as a threat. They viewed it as a threat because it would stir things up. If you see that there's been a recent article in the Times warning against the temptations of class warfare. Now, they don't think Keir Starmer's going to suddenly pursue class warfare. They're worried that things are getting so bad for the working class that class warfare is going to break out. That's what they're worried about. And the reason why they didn't want Corbyn, the same reason that the ruling class in the United States didn't want Sanders, is because, as Kobe's comment correctly indicates, yes, they're done with social democracy. It was a necessary concession. And when that period closed and they needed to draw back all those reforms, they did so, and then they're determined it's not coming back. And so when you try and elevate something or someone from a previous period, when the ruling class has drawn a line under it and the class balance of forces just doesn't support it anymore, it looks ridiculous and pathetic because, again, the forces to support it are just no longer in existence anymore. And that's why it's not just that Corbyn and Sanders and Mélenchon are very weak characters with confused petty bourgeois politics. It's just that the time is different. The forces are aligned differently. The forces are not there. The balance of forces do not support a return of social democracy, nor will they ever. The choice now is quite straightforward. It's either let the ruling class grind us all into the dirt or overthrow them. Those are the two choices. Tom Joad says, Corbyn failed because he tried to appease the right in the PLP. Big mistake. You'll never get the chance again to rectify it. I would say that was somewhat correct, Tom. Where I would disagree with you, though, is in what the rights of the PLP represent. They represent the most, shall we say, aggressive interests of the British imperialists inside the Labour Party. And that's why they're so militant and make such a lot of noise, because they are pure creatures of the ruling class. The left is too, but the right is a very much a purer version of ruling class interests. So he was essentially, through them, trying to appease the ruling class, and he never could. Kobe says Orban is still as liberal as in his heyday, he allows Vietnamese, Indonesian, and other certain immigrants to come to Hungary. Yeah, he builds himself up as the big Catholic redeemer, but in reality, he's as much of a old-fashioned Cold War era liberal as anybody else. He hasn't changed in reality. Everybody else around him has changed. That's why he appears to be something of a relic. Sean says, my daughter was working with Corbyn when he was leader. She said he was no leader and hid in his office most of the time. Yeah, he was not suited for it. I mean, the project would never have worked anyway. As I outlined yesterday, and as I've outlined many times before, so I won't waste your time and my breath going over it now. But again, even just beyond that, he just was ill-suited to it. He wasn't the kind of person who would march up to, or get somebody else to march up to some horrible little bastard like Ian Austin or John Mann and do something which he thoroughly deserved, which is pick him up by his ankles and dangle him over the edge of a bridge, which is how you should respond to people like that. Not that I'm suggesting violence for a second, but in a hypothetical scenario, if someone did to somebody I was working with what apparently Ian Austin did to Jeremy Corbyn, which is come up to him in the street and scream in his face all kinds of abuse. When somebody did that to me, I'd punch him in the fucking face or nut him. Because Ian Austin's a fucking coward. They all are. Or I'd have if I was Corbyn's age, let's just assume that you're a man in his late 60s who can't do that sort of thing. Then you have a bunch of big guys around you. You pick out a bunch of big guys and you have them go around with you. And if anybody tries it on, let's be completely blunt here. You give them a taste of their own medicine and send them on their way. Yeah? It won't happen again. Yeah, there'll be a media scandal about it, but the voters will love it far more if you do that. By sitting there and looking like some sort of fucking Christian martyr, again, he just looked pathetic all the time. Couldn't handle it. Should have quit. In all honesty, should have quit. Was kept in position by other people with very cynical interests, I think. And I maybe stayed on out of some sense of duty, but was only really damaging the cause he said he believed in. President Jesus says, have you read Vijay Prashad's theory of hyper-imperialism? He seems to think a return to social democracy is a real possibility. I haven't read the book, but I've heard Prashad talk about this, and he's quite profoundly wrong. But then again, the man's a social democrat. So, of course, he's going to say that social democracy is a real possibility. It ain't. It really isn't. So, but we will come back to that in future episodes. Well, so going to draw this to a close for today. Thank you for joining me for this stroll down the highways and byways of British electoral politics and the miserable fate of the Conservatives and the SNP. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in. Thanks to everybody who supports the programme on Patreon. And we'll be doing a Patreon special on Israel, on the question of does it control the United States or not. That will be up on Sunday of this week as a live stream. So I will be back with you then. Until then, though, I'm going to throw you back over to your musical accompaniment.
Окраин, южный город до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови вы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать.